The purpose of this paper is to investigate a certain tension I think there is between synchronicity and the individual emphasis that mainstream Jungianism has, and how this relates to the concept of meaning in general. I think the problem is that there's a particular desire in mainstream Jungianism to have a highly individualized notion of development, supported by these somewhat philosophically complicated concepts like synchronicity. And concepts like synchronicity do not lend themselves to any sort of individualized philosophy of development, because the consequence of having a concept like synchronicity, which is ostensibly acausal, is that what happens is that the identity criteria for synchronicity are fundamentally at odds with the identity criteria for individuals. As soon as you have an acausal connection, then what you have is something that falls outside of the windowing requirements and identity criteria for space and time in general, and that fundamentally contradicts the concept of an individual. So what I try to do here is tease apart the spatial and temporal elements of the concept of synchronicity and show that the temporal conceptual aspects of synchronicity are more fundamental than the spatial, to a degree that it's psychologically irrelevant what the spatial requirements in synchronicity are. And that means that the only concept of synchronicity that's left that's really usable is one that lends itself to an aspatial, purely temporal type of coincidence. And when you look at that and the consequences of that, and look at some examples of that, what happens is that you're left with a concept which is more philosophically consistent, but is simply not relevant to individuals anymore. And I think this is the case with putative synchronicities. They're often used in mainstream Jungian thought to be a signal, or sometimes a marker of individuation progress or activation of something seen to be desirable in the process of what we call individuation. And my view on this is that synchronicity cannot be used that way. If it's a coherent concept at all, it's a concept that is not relevant to individuals at all. And I think it's part of the somewhat over-individualized Jungian arrogance that we like to use these examples as examples supporting some sort of evidence of progress, individual progress. And I think you can't really do that with concepts like synchronicity. There's something very deep in the notion of connections which are not the sort of everyday typical space and time connections. And of course, as we know, Jung was quite interested in this in terms of the implications of modern physics. And there's justifiable reason to be interested in that. But if you follow that in a reasonably rigorous way, you can't also claim that these sorts of concepts can be used to further the individual aspect of psychology. And so this is the purpose of really this paper, to show that when you go into and analyze a little bit more and go into the typical examples of synchronicity, what you're left with is a very, very deep and interesting concept, but one which cannot be used in the traditional ways that it's used in the field. So that's what I'm trying to do in this paper, by first looking at how synchronicity and meaning interrelate, and then looking at how the concepts of space and time individually break down when one looks at examples of synchronicity. And I think this leads us, this is a topic for further exploration, to a sort of a much more monistic dual aspect type of metaphysics, which is somewhat counter to the implicitly dualistic metaphysics that a lot of mainstream Jungians have, I believe.